All right, let's get down to it in regards to this TCU matchup. So I see Gentry Williams should be back this week. Dillon Gabriel could or should be available. And then we also have Jalil Farouk. Are those pretty much the three in question in regards to injuries?
Yes, pretty much. And Gentry Williams is expected back. He has suited the last 2 weeks, but just hasn't played. So you figure Oklahoma was probably in a situation where if they desperately needed Gentry Williams to go play cornerback, they probably would have pulled the trigger on it. But they haven't needed him. They ran away from West Virginia, and BYU was gashing him on the ground, not through the air, excuse me. So you didn't really need Gentry Williams, didn't really feel the need to press him into action against BYU. But Gabriel and Farouk are interesting cases, Mark, and that's because they both are dealing with what peripherally appeared to be head injuries. And Oklahoma is one of those schools that they have a reputation for being extremely scrupulous about players clearing the concussion protocol. And they are never, ever, without exception, going to rush anybody back from a head injury / concussion. And so, to be honest with you, I'm sure it has happened before. I'm not implying that it hasn't, but off the top of my head, I cannot recall the last time a player at Oklahoma cleared the concussion protocol in a single week, let alone an abbreviated week. So the fact that you have a 6-day turnaround from BYU to TCU, combined with the fact that Oklahoma generally takes things very slow, that training staff, that medical staff generally takes things very slow with their players who have to go through the concussion protocol. I wasn't all that optimistic going into Brent Venables' press conference yesterday that Gabriel and Farouk were going to play on Black Friday. But Venables comes out and says, hey, you know what? If those guys progress the way that they have the first couple days since we got back from Provo, I expect that they'll be available. And it was a stark contrast to last year before the Texas game when Gabriel was dealing with a similar injury and Venables refused to answer questions or discuss his status at all. So again, it would be pretty unprecedented, at least in recent memory, for a guy to clear concussion protocol at OU in a single week, but it does sound like Venables, at least, unless it's gamesmanship, and that's always a possibility, he does expect to have his quarterback and his number one wide receiver back.
And I'm glad to hear that. We tend to, at times, think about these games as like video games, and these guys are not necessarily human to us that, especially the fans that just watch on TV and so forth and don't have contact with these guys as individuals. They're young men. They have lives to lead. They have futures that need to be taken into consideration. So that's good to hear that they take that extremely seriously, even beyond what most teams do there. Parker Thunes here. We're talking Oklahoma football, of course, here at the Voice of College Football. It's the final go around for Oklahoma hosting TCU. And so one of the big storylines, obviously, was Jackson Arnold and his performance in the second half coming in for Dillon Gabriel. He wasn't asked to light it up. He threw, about 9 passes in the game, but at the same time showed off his running skills and that he could, maybe more so than anything, Parker, handle the offense.
Well, and that's what you want a backup quarterback to do, especially on a day where offensive points and sustained long drives came at a premium, partially because of the conditions, partially because of the fact that both of these teams played a pretty good defensive game. Oklahoma did surrender a lot more than they probably would have liked to on the ground, but they tightened up when they need to. They won the turnover battle 3-0. And so this was a game that both of these teams just kind of had to grind out. And so would it have been great and would it have been a fun story if Jackson Arnold had come in and slung the ball around for 250 yards in the second half and thrown 2 or 3 touchdown passes? Sure, but that was probably never going to happen given the circumstances. And within those circumstances, really all you can ask of a backup quarterback is that he comes in and doesn't crash the bus. And that's what Jackson Arnold did. He was 5 for 9 for 33 yards. Carried 8 times for 24 yards, led a couple of long drives, one of which culminated in a Gavin Sawchuk touchdown that was ultimately the decisive scored. And he also led a drive at the very tail end of the game that allowed Oklahoma to run out the clock. There was another drive he led in which Zach Schmidt missed a 28-yard field goal at the end. Would have liked to have had points there. In the end, it didn't hurt the Sooners, though. And so, yeah, again, was Arnold spectacular? No, but he didn't need to be. And you probably wouldn't have liked to see him try to be spectacular. They did push the ball downfield on a couple of occasions. He overshot Nick Anderson on a deep ball that might have gone for 6 if he hits it. But he did exactly what he needed to do to put Oklahoma in position to win that game, and they ultimately did. Everybody on the Oklahoma staff and in that locker room, they were incredibly pleased with not only Arnold's performance, but also his poise. That 3rd and 7 throw to Jalil Farouk with just over 2 minutes left that effectively iced the game, that was a play that Arnold checked into. That was not the original call. He audibled at the line of scrimmage, saw he had a one-on-one matchup outside with Farouk, the guy who he seems to have the most trust in, and he took advantage of it. And that right there is something that, it's not true freshman stuff. So he did have some freshman moments, but there were also some flashes of that promise that made Arnold a 5-star recruit in last year's cycle.
So, Parker, not the best of opponent in BYU. They're a 5-win football team, but difficult conditions to a certain extent, hostile place to play, just known for being a death trap for a number of teams that are highly ranked. And then in addition to that, you lose your starting quarterback about halfway through the game. Are all of those in play to kind of excuse what was, in a sense, a lackluster performance?
Yeah, I think so. You got to hand things off to another quarterback mid-game, and it was hostile. It was rainy. That's a really fun environment. That's a really fun venue to watch a college football game at, Mark. It was legitimately one of my favorite road trips, maybe my absolute favorite road trip ever. That BYU crowd brought it. That BYU team brought it. They played a heck of a football game. And, when you're a heavy favorite like that, it's easy to look at an outcome where the underdog covers and it's a lot closer than many expect, and it's easy to say, okay, well, we didn't play our A game. And to an extent, that's true. Oklahoma didn't. But by the same token, you just have to tip your cap to BYU because that was a team that fought tooth and nail for 60 minutes, executed a game plan that kept them abreast with the Sooners for the vast majority of that football game, and ultimately made some really key plays throughout that helped sustain their momentum and prevented the Sooners from pulling away. So in as much as Oklahoma left some meat on the bone, it was also just a really strong game by that BYU team, which showed out on senior day in front of their home crowd and came very, very close to scoring an upset victory.
Here's the deal, folks. This is our Sooners Live edition that we do here each and every week, at least once a week, sometimes twice, 139 times, as you see there on the screen. We bring through the very best that we can find, Parker Thune included, to talk Oklahoma football with us. So if you have any suggestions, recommendations, requests, please let us know. And you will see a version of this on our Big 12 channel as well that we launched before the season. And yes, of course, we will transition that to our SEC channel when that time comes very soon. And then put together an edition of preview with TCU side on this on the main channel at the Voice of College Football. So, but in terms of the live show, please make it here. And you do that by subscribing and hitting the bell for the notifications. TCU, a rough season for them. I think that most of us had forecasted a little bit better, nothing close to what they accomplished last year. They're coming off a big point total against Baylor. Josh Hoover at 412 yards, Jared Wiley, a guy that a lot of us became familiar with, of course, in their, I was going to call it a championship season. It was in no way a championship season, although they made it to the championship game, but did not win the Big 12. Nor, of course, the national championship, but Jared Wiley, a really good player, and they put up points against Baylor. And this is the final go for them as well in regards to this season in the Big 12, trying to get to a bowl game. So that's their incentive at 5-6. I have not looked at the line, Parker. I got to think it's about 15, something in that range. Your thoughts about this coming matchup?
Yeah, I believe last I checked, you're right, Mark. It was Oklahoma by 14-ish. So I'm not sure how that's moved since Sunday, but that is kind of, especially with Oklahoma on their home field, that is kind of the expectation is the Sooners by circa 2 touchdowns. Now, for this TCU team, there was going to be regression, right? Especially losing Max Duggan. And just if you watched that season back last year, you watched those 12 games that TCU won en route to an undefeated record through the regular season and a berth in the Big 12 championship game, ultimately a college football playoff victory and a national championship appearance. You kind of got the sense that there was an element of chance that went into it, right? Like they played well, don't get me wrong, but there were some things that bounced their way over the course of the season where if you replay it, 10, 20, 100 times over, that's probably not a team that's replicating that season in 2022 ever again. So again, credit to TCU for making it happen, but it was always, I would say they outperformed what they actually were as a football team in 2022. And so that's all the more reason why things were going to crash back down to earth. But as we sit here today, the Horned Frogs are 5-6, and you brought it up. They're playing for a bowl game. And where realistically, where are they going to go, right? Not a bowl game that anybody is going to be paying a ton of attention to, but it's less about that for many of these programs and more about getting the opportunity to practice 15 more times, see what you have going into next year, kind of process whether there are a few standouts that emerge and see what kind of firepower you can carry into 2024. So it is as much about the practices as it is about the actual game for many teams that are kind of straddling that line of bowl eligibility. So I would imagine TCU does come out on Friday with a little bit extra motivation because they know what's at stake. Josh Hoover has played good ball for the most part since taking over as this program starter. They have really just aired it out. They've let him stand back there in the pocket and pick defenses apart with his arm. They're not going to try exceptionally hard to establish the run, but the last few games they haven't really needed to. Now, Kansas State beat them soundly, but other than that, Hoover's played good ball and TCU has played pretty good ball here down the stretch. So this is a program that in somewhat understated fashion has given Oklahoma several battles over the last few years and obviously took them to the woodshed last year down in Fort Worth. Dylan Gabriel was injured in that game and the Horned Frogs just ended up pouring it on. But I do expect they'll come out with some fight. I would think depending on where the line falls, it's probably a coin flip whether Oklahoma covers, but this does feel like a Sooner team that's better than the opposition in the Horned Frogs by about 2 touchdowns. So it's close to a push in my eyes.
Well, Mark, I talked to you a lot more last year around this time. And you never call, you never write, you don't text, it's been quite the change from 2023 to 2022, like you said, but a little sign of hope here over the last 6 quarters of football. So hoping TCU can finish strong and get to a bowl game at least.
That's right. They really aired it out in recent weeks, as you say, but specifically against Baylor. Josh Hoover with over 400 yards passing. Jared Wiley, a guy that we got familiar with during the stretch drive of 2022, had a nice game as well. Is there going to be some balance in Norman on the offensive side for the Frogs, or are they going to just continue to sling it?
Well, I think that Kendall Briles has shown that given the opportunity, he is going to air it out and just throw the ball around. He has a ton of faith in Josh Hoover. We saw that, in his first career start against Baylor or against BYU, he threw the ball 50 plus times. And so there was no worries from, day one about this kid being able to handle the load. And I would expect a pass heavy attack, not because TCU doesn't have a ton of faith and confidence in Amani Bailey, who also had a really nice game against Baylor and has quietly put together a really impressive season. But the offensive line has not been able to run block for anything, really. And that's kind of where TCU struggles in 2023 have started. It's just in the ability to set the edge, block up the middle, spring a guy like Amani Bailey, who isn't necessarily known for his patience in the backfield. But develop holes for him to spring loose. The dude in the open field is fast and he's hard to tackle. there just hasn't been a lot of open field opportunities for him. So yeah, I think that's where you'll see TCU really try to attack the Sooners on Friday. To the level of success, we'll see. The Hoovers look great against teams like BYU and Baylor, which aren't exactly good defensive units. He looked great in the second half against Texas as well, though a Texas team that had kind of taken its foot off the gas. So this will be a big test for him in a high pressure situation.
Melissa, when you put together, again, still the hopes of salvaging a winning season, and then, of course, getting to a bowl game, which, certain people put in various categories these days in regards to the importance of a bowl game, but it's still almost like, did you make a bowl game? You didn't make a bowl game, really? Kind of thing. So there's a perception there about bowl teams versus non-bowl teams, and certainly the practice time for the young players to move into 2024. So there has to be some significance to this game on those levels.
Oh, absolutely. Look, first and foremost, you can't play in the national championship game less than a year ago and not make a bowl game the next year. That hasn't happened very often historically, and TCU currently could be on pace to be the worst team following a season in which they appear in the national championship. And you have to think for Sonny Dykes too. Not that his, resume is on the line here, but when you look at the last 12 games of his career at TCU, the results have not been positive. Not a lot of wins over plus 500 teams, and not a lot of confidence in how his team has performed. So this is a big opportunity for him. It's huge for recruiting. I think TCU fans have been disappointed with either the lack of high-level recruiting or the lack of news coming out about high-level recruiting. Coming off of that national championship run a season ago, I think we thought there'd be a little bit more juice. And so if you fall flat, that becomes a lot of negative recruiting in an era that's going to be hugely important when you look ahead at the teams that you're going to be up against on the recruiting trail, not just in the Big 12, but with Texas and Oklahoma getting that SEC bump as well. They already were the elite recruiting universities. They're going to have even a little bit more juice. So this is a really important time for TCU. Making a bowl game and getting to 6-6 is not going to make or break the future of Sonny Dykes' Fort Worth tenure, but it would be anything certainly disappointing to not at least have the opportunity to get those 15 extra practices and have a winning season the year after that magical run.
Melissa, I got to say, it struck me kind of odd when I looked at the Big 12 schedule during the off season when it was revealed, because the Big 12, like the other conferences, have typically taken this as rivalry week. And I'm seeing nothing there. It just looks like somebody just threw the games at a calendar to say this isn't necessarily going to be the week that Oklahoma State play Bedlam, and on down the line, Kansas State, of course, played last weekend. TCU, Texas, maybe Texas Tech. That's about the only angle I can find there. But is there any, with Oklahoma moving on to the SEC, any angst there, any pride there from TCU fans in regards to let's send them off and kick them out the door to the SEC?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think you saw a lot of extra juice around the Texas game, a team that TCU has frankly dominated since joining the Big 12. That was just TCU's third loss since 2012 against the Longhorns. And if you watched them in that second half, you saw how much that game meant to the players and the coaching staffs. TCU has not won in Norman since 2005, which is kind of an insane thing to say when you think about some of the teams that TCU has fielded in the new era of the Big 12. They got a little bit lucky, that they had Oklahoma at home in 2014 in that magical season. But one of their, I think, only 3 losses in 2015 was in Norman on a failed 2-point conversion that I'll forever never forget the fingernail of that Oklahoma defensive back just to get a tip on a ball that would have been completed. So this one does mean something. That the odds of TCU playing in Norman again are very, very slim. And so when you go to a place you haven't been able to play, when you have an opportunity to make a bowl game and an opportunity to keep Oklahoma out of the Big 12 championship so that you don't end up with a Texas-Oklahoma Big 12 championship in those two teams' final year. I think that this one does mean a lot to TCU players. I think it means a lot to the TCU fan base. And certainly there's a lot on the line for the Sooners as well. So I think you'll see a competitive game if we see the same version of TCU that we've seen for the last 6 quarters, where they're finally looking a little bit invested and engaged. And as Josh Newton said on Monday, playing unselfishly for the first time this season, then I think they can play with an Oklahoma team that showed a few cracks here and there and might be without their starting quarterback.
Melissa, you mentioned the record in the last 12 games. Is there a thought that there's concern about this stretch? There was obviously an understanding that this season wasn't going to be last season. So this was anticipated to a degree. So is there just a thought that, okay, we knew that there would be a step back. Everything's still going in the right direction. This is just one of those transition seasons, or is there legitimate concern?
I mean, I think it can be both. Jamie Plunkett, my co-host on the Frogs Insider podcast, and I spoke about this on our podcast this week. You can find that in Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, of course, under the Republic of Football Network on Dave Campbell's Texas Football. That is such a mouthful to get out. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the fan base is why there is such kind of a negative reaction to this season. We all knew who we were losing, right? You lose a Max Duggan, who is a generational quarterback. You lose a Quentin Johnson, who's a first-round draft pick. We won't talk about what happened Sunday. Everybody's seen that drop. You lose Kendre Miller and Amari DeMarcado, both guys who are getting snaps in the NFL at running back. You lose Steve Avila, a second-round guard who is starting for the LA Rams. I mean, there were Trey Tomlinson, who was the Thorpe Award winner. I mean, there were key guys that left, 8 guys that got drafted. So you knew there was going to be a step back. But I think the issue comes in with how much we were sold during spring ball and into fall camp. We were told that this was the most physically impressive team that Sonny Dykes has ever seen. We were told this was one of the 3 most talented teams that he's ever coached. The stuff coming out of fall camp wasn't, hey, we're going to take a big step back. It was like, this team is ready to compete. But Jamie brought up a really good point in that, of course, this is one of the 3 most talented teams that Sonny Dykes has ever been around. He's been at Louisiana Tech. He's been at Cal, which was an absolute dumpster fire of a football program before he got there and after he left. And he's been at SMU, where he certainly didn't have the ability to recruit at the level that TCU has had. And so even TCU, coming off of kind of 4 down years of recruiting, still had more talent in the barn, and he recruited a really high level when he arrived on scene. So maybe the verbiage, maybe the semantics of how he presented his expectations going into this season, that's something he might learn from. Gary Patterson used to always talk about on paper and paper tigers, and Sonny Dykes wanted to sell us those paper tigers really, really hard and capitalize on the momentum that he had. But when you build high expectations and you fall short, people tend to get distrustful, and people start bringing up that November record Sonny Dykes has had over the course of his career, and what a negative that's been. So he's going to have some rebuilding to do, not just in the program, but amongst the fan base and the donor base as well. This should have been a home run season. I think 8 wins and people would have been completely and totally bought in, no problem whatsoever. But the way that they've lost some of these games, the way that they lost to Colorado, the way that they lost to Iowa State and West Virginia, where they just didn't look interested in competing at a high level, that I think has caused some questions. And also all the capital that he spent and all the goodwill he spent to bring in somebody with the Briles last name. You can't do that and spend all that goodwill and then go, 5-7, which is a realistic possibility for this program. So I don't think that people are going to be calling for his job. I'll be interested to see if he makes any staff changes or if some people elect to move on. But he's not going to get this grace twice in a row. I think people will kind of wipe it away and say, okay, we're going to give him one more chance, but he's going to have to show marked improvement and more buy-in, I think, in 2024 before people start to get a little bit antsy.
Melissa Treebwasser, Frogs Insider Podcast. And Melissa, for anyone who missed it when you ripped through it the first time, we want to make sure that everyone knows where to find you.
Yeah, you can find me at the Coach Melissa on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. You can find Frogs Insider on Apple, Spotify, under the Frogs Insider podcast, or the Republic of Football Network, part of Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Wherever you listen to podcasts, that's where it is. We talk a lot of TCU football, obviously. TCU basketball, both men's and women's teams started 5-0 for the first time in TCU history. So we're super, super excited about what's going on in those programs. And I will say nobody covers baseball better than the Frogs Insider podcast when that season kicks up.
Awesome. Melissa, happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for dropping by. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you as well. Hopefully we'll have a bowl game to preview with you. We'll see. Fingers crossed, right?
Let's do that.